If you're here for the city council meeting, that'll probably start around 7:10. But thank you for being here. It's important for everybody to get up to speed on our finances, and we got some great topics tonight. The first item of business is the roll. Clerk, can you please, or Director Hollett, please call the roll.
Certainly. Thank you, Honorable Mayor Tack.
Here.
Chairman Preschlack.
Here.
Alderman Novit.
Here.
Alderman Waldeck.
Present.
Alderman Notes.
Here.
Alderman Powers.
Here.
Alderman Goshgarian.
Here.
Alderman Weber.
Here.
Alderman Walther.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. The next item is a consideration of minutes from the Finance Committee meeting held on April 17th, 2023. Whoever was at that meeting, any comments, questions, adds, deletes, subtracts? Everyone's good. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second. Is a roll call vote?
Yes, sir. Alderman Tack.
Aye.
Or Mayor Tack, excuse me.
It's okay. Aye. Aye.
Chairman Preschlack.
Aye.
Alderman Novit.
Aye.
Alderman Waldeck.
I'm going to abstain since I wasn't present for the meeting.
Okay. Alderman Notes.
Aye.
Alderman Powers.
Aye.
Alderman Goshgarian.
Aye.
Alderman Weber.
Aye.
Alderman Walther.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, thank you. Our next item is the annual report of the Cemetery Commission. John Anderson, thank you for your service. This is his third time in front of our Finance Committee, and we really appreciate your service to our community. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Chairman Preschlack, thank you, along with the members of the City Council Finance Committee, and thank you for this opportunity to present our annual report on behalf of the Cemetery Commission. Let me start, I think I've started this presentation in prior years with the same place, which is our mission statement for the Cemetery Commission. It was adopted 10 years ago, and this mission remains unchanged today. Our commission work is grounded in and directed by the principles in our mission statement, which covers our commission's core responsibilities and stewardship of the cemetery and its resources. Our financial assets, that is, the cemetery property and the natural resources that go with the cemetery, both just for today perhaps, but also for all the years and generations ahead. So it's important for us to be thinking about not just today, but we hope generations and generations for the future. As for our financial and investment management responsibilities, the Cemetery Commission is guided by clear guardrails and objectives which are included in our comprehensive investment policy. Every year our commission reviews this policy, and then we direct our investment advisor, currently William Blair, to follow and conform with the provisions of that policy. And we ask our investment advisor to provide a full review of our investment performance to our commission at each of our quarterly meetings throughout the year. Our invested assets are mainly intended to fund the cemetery's future operating expenses once all the plots and niches have been sold. And I'll address our projections for that in a little bit later here. And also to fund capital improvements periodically if they're needed. These funds could also serve as a safety net for current operating expenses, but currently our operating expenses are generally well covered by our operating revenues from the cemetery, and our intention has been not to touch that money for operating expenses in the near term, in the short term. Our investment policy has been in place since 2008. We made some tweaks to it in 2021, and under our investment policy, the Commission is required to carry out a reassessment every 5 years of the performance and the relationship with our investment advisor. As I mentioned, that's William Blair. The next slide presents the results of our combined funds investment assets as of the end of the past fiscal year. In other words, fiscal year ending April 30th of 2023. Compared to April 30th of 2022, and then also comparing it back to August of 2008. And that's when we actually had retained Blair to begin our work with them, and frankly, to have a more robust approach for managing our investment assets. One thing I'll point out is that the total assets reported here include the amounts that are, the assets that are held by within the William Blair portfolio, but it also includes our bank account cash here in Lake Forest. So it's the combination of all of that. As of April 30th of 2023, our total investment funds were just above $11.5 million for the cemetery. As noted at the bottom of the slide, that's a 1.6% increase in total value year over year from 4/30/2022. And that's generally in keeping with prevailing market conditions in equity and fixed income markets. However, it's worth noting that the value of our total combined funds have increased by 33% over the 3-year period from April 30th of 2020, which was the beginning of the pandemic, just as a comparison back for that period of time. So a 33% increase, and our total funds have increased more than 3.5 times since we started working with Blair in 2008. The Commission has had several discussions about our investments, clearly. We understand this outcome in our accounts, and we're generally satisfied with the performance of our portfolio. I do want to drill down into one piece of our total funds and point out that our total cash available in these funds today is roughly around $2 million, with more than $1.3 million of this cash held in city bank accounts. It's not unlike many investment portfolios these days where as we move out of certain positions, you move into cash perhaps, as opposed to other investments. But that's one reason. The other reason is we've had very strong revenue results at the cemetery with the sale of niches and graves. And so above budget cemetery revenues and, if you will, sales clearly have contributed to this. Our general rule is to keep cash of about a year's worth of budget, if you will, for the cemetery. It's about $800,000 or $900,000. So we're well above that, and we're working with the city right now to determine how much we should move from city accounts back into the Blair portfolio or not, given the fact that we also are spending money on the expansion of the Memorial Garden, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple minutes. So I just wanted to make sure that you saw that it's a very different situation with cash than it has been over the, at least the last 2 years versus prior years. This next slide, a couple things to point out. One is how are we investing the equity portion of our investments? The top graphic recaps that distribution of our domestic equity investments, and the lion's share of our equity investments are in large cap and mid cap company stocks. A very small minority is in small cap stocks. In the table below that, it's maybe hard to see this, but actually this recaps what you received in your reports, I think, in advance of this meeting. That presents a comparison of our overall performance versus a blended market benchmark for our overall portfolio. Our investment portfolio performance was just below the benchmark for the fiscal year ending April 30th of 2023. But our portfolio's performance has exceeded the benchmark in 5 of the last 6 years, also in both 3- and 5-year annualized returns. The next table at the top of this slide presents our investment asset distribution as of April 30th of 2023 versus the end of fiscal year 22 and versus 2008, and compares this distribution to our allowable asset allocation range and mid-range targets per our investment policy. I would describe our investment portfolio as a balanced and fairly conservative and safe investment portfolio, and we are focused on the long term, not the short term, but the long-term investment results, since we are not using these funds for the near-term needs of the cemetery. Cash and fixed income investments as of 4/30/23 were at 38% of our total portfolio, and that's somewhat above our mid-range target of 30%, and that's kind of follows in what I talked about a few minutes ago on the cash position. Again, a lot of that's due to strong revenue results at the cemetery, as well as our focus on putting a little bit more safety, if you will, cash emphasis on our investment portfolio than in prior years. And likely that will change as we go forward from here. We've also I should point out that we've also moved our fixed income investments to holdings with shorter durations as part of the overall composition of that component. Our total domestic equity investments as of 4/30/2023 were at 48% of the total portfolio, and that's near our mid-range target of 50% for equity, for domestic equity. And it's worth pointing out that this proportion has come down significantly since 2020, when it was as high as 57%. So we've moved away from a significant push on equity unto itself. There's one other slice here, and that's international equities. Our international equity investments were at 14% as of April 30th of 2023, and that's below our mid-range target of 20%, and frankly, we've dialed down some of our international equity holdings this past year, and for that matter, the past 2 years, with higher volatility in non-US markets. I think it's indicated here in this last statement at the bottom of the slide. It's probably hard to read, but until this year's loan for the Memorial Garden Phase 2 project, the cemetery has not had any outstanding debt since 2014. We had borrowed $1.6 million in 2000, and that was to construct the actual beginning of the Memorial Gardens. And that was paid off within 15 years for that first phase of the gardens, as well as the construction of the cemetery office and the gatehouse. So that was paid off fully in 14. And then since then, frankly, during the past several years, we've had a number of different, what I would call capital improvements, ravine restorations, repaved roadways in the cemetery. We've had some major equipment purchases, and all of those were generally paid out of our operating expenses without debt. So we've only had to dip into our reserves and our investment accounts on a very limited basis, either for a limited amount of money or a limited amount of time. And that's our general overall strategy. So, speaking of capital improvements, we, as the City Council knows, as the City Council approved earlier this year, we started the Phase 2 of Memorial Garden building out at the Lake Forest Cemetery in May. The existing Memorial Gardens were constructed in 2000, but a portion of the scope of that original construction project had been adjusted to keep the project within budget at the time. The Memorial Garden Phase 2 project will finish out the construction of the remaining niches that were contemplated in the original design of the Memorial Gardens back in 2000. The Memorial Gardens currently hold 1,412 columbarium niches, of which 566, 40%, are sold or reserved. With the completion of this Phase 2 project, we will add 414 new niches. We are also making needed improvements in the grading and landscaping within 2 of the 4 gardens, the ones that are closest to the gate at the cemetery, along with repairing and replacing the bluestone walkways throughout all of the garden, and that's underway right now. The total cost for this Phase 2 project of the Memorial Gardens is $1.1 million, and this will be funded by a loan from the city that the City Council has approved, which will be repaid over the next 10 years from our operating revenues, and perhaps from our investment gains if we so have that, we can put in that direction. At current prices, the income that we will realize from the sale of these 414 new niches will be about $2.5 million. So we feel it's a strong return for this improvement. We currently expect that this Phase 2 of the Memorial Garden will be completed in September or October, so it's moving along quite well. Also on this slide, we talk about a future anticipated project. We're still working on the initial design plans, but we're continuing to explore the need for the construction of a maintenance equipment storage building that would be near the current gatehouse office area. Currently, equipment is stored outside for much of the cemetery maintenance in good and bad weather throughout the year, and it's obviously having an impact on our equipment. So we're thinking about moving those inside if we can get the building to a place that's both acceptable for design and usage. So those are improvements that we're talking about that are part of the cemetery either now or going forward. And then last, I think this came up in our last discussion. So where are we with current and projected cemetery space? As I mentioned earlier, our invested assets are really intended for future operating expenses once all the graves and niches have been sold. And we do not anticipate that we'll reach that point until the end of this century. In other words, 75 years out or more. Today, the cemetery includes nearly 15,000 grave spaces, and slightly more than 2,300 of these grave spaces, are like 15%, are still available for purchase. That's thinking about our existing grave spaces. In addition, the cemetery will have more than 1,800 columbarium niches, and then when our Memorial Garden project phase 2 is completed this fall, and roughly 850 of those niches are still available for purchase. The cemetery property also includes a few areas that have not been platted and yet developed, and these could generate another 800 grave spaces for us in the future. So based on our annual average grave and niche sales during the past 5 years, we've conservatively estimated that we will be able to provide available spaces throughout the rest of this century. And we're pretty pleased with that. Although I should point out that some buying patterns we find are lumpy. They come and go, if you will, but also the move towards cremation has changed. There are more cremations today than actual grave burials in the traditional sense. So we will have to monitor that as we go forward. That's the end of our presentation. Any questions from the Finance Committee?
Yeah, thank you, John. I have two, and then I'll open it up to my colleagues to see if they have any. First, on the macro, is there other opportunities to acquire land, or is it totally built out?
I think really we are landlocked,
Okay.
Given where we are with ravines around us, the lake, and also St. Mary's Cemetery next to us. So.
The second question on pricing, as the availability changes, how do you, so what is the pricing policy, supply and demand, and how do you think through that?
So we really do a very good job of benchmarking pricing throughout the metropolitan areas and clearly look at different levels of cemeteries and are looking at probably 3 or 4 that are more comparable to the very premium, if you will, cemetery that we have here. So we carefully monitor that. But admittedly, I think we have only 2 or 3 mausoleum spaces left, for example, at the cemetery. This is more historical in terms of demand for that. We clearly have adjusted the pricing on those kinds of larger spaces, family spaces, because not only the size of the lot, but also the demand with a limited supply would cause an adjustment in pricing. We review that pricing, not only for the pricing of lots and niches, but also the pricing of all of our services. We benchmark it, look at it carefully, and do adjustments every year.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from my colleagues?
Just
for
a
John?
comment, thank you very much for your stewardship.
It's a pleasure.
Terribly important, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yep.
John.
Yeah.
All right, next item, our Police and Fire Pension Board investment update from Director Holub. We just had a subcommittee meeting with our actuary this afternoon, and there's been quite a bit of change at the state level around asset consolidation across these 2 funds. And Elizabeth's going to give us the exciting update and some historical perspective for the council. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Great, thank you, Chairman Preschlack. Good evening. In years past, you would have received similar presentations from the Fire Pension Board and Police Pension Board to the presentation you just heard from John related to investment performance, but that changed a couple years ago with Public Act 101 0610, also commonly known as the consolidation legislation. That public act was effective January 1st of 2020. And that act required that all of the investment assets of local police and fire pension boards be consolidated into a single statewide fund, one for police and one for fire. The act required consolidation of those assets by June 30th of 2022. The consolidation legislation noted specifically that the consolidation was for investment purposes only. So your local pension boards continue to manage administration of benefits and benefit determinations for their board members. So you do still have a very active board for both police and fire. So it created two entities, the Fire Pension Investment Fund and the Illinois Police Officers Pension Investment Fund. In the Fire Pension Investment Fund, about 296 local fire funds were consolidated into that entity, and police officers, about 353 local pension boards of police were consolidated into IPOPF. Lake Forest specifically, the Fire Pension Board transferred assets November 1st of 2021, and the Police Pension Board transferred assets on June 1st of 2022. So both local pension boards in Lake Forest met the June 30th, 2022 requirement. The primary purpose of the consolidation legislation was to improve investment returns for all local pension funds. The concept being that consolidation of assets would allow at a state level better returns similar to what IMRF has historically been able to provide. It also gave the opportunity for the consolidated funds to invest in investment options that local pension boards had previously not been able to invest in. The other benefit is that the concept was that investment expenses would go down by bringing all those assets together under one management, would reduce investment expenses for all the local funds for a financial benefit. Just to give some comparison to investment authority before and after consolidation, prior to the consolidation, the state statutes divided local pension funds into three categories based on size. And the smaller the pension fund, the more restricted they were in the assets that they could invest in. Lake Forest benefited because both of our police and fire pension plans were over $10 million. So we did have the opportunity to invest 65% of our assets in equities, whereas smaller pension funds had much more restriction on equity investments. Clearly, over the last 10 years or so, with fixed returns so low, lower asset pension funds specifically, were losing significant ground in their funding opportunities because they simply couldn't get return on their assets. The next slide just gives an overview of the current investment allocation of both the Police Consolidated Fund in blue and the Fire Consolidated Fund in red. Both consolidated funds opted to develop a short-term or interim asset allocation and a long-term asset allocation. So what you see is as those assets are coming in initially, they're a little bit more conservative in the types of investments they're investing in. But over the long term, many of those fixed income investments, even U.S. equity investments, are going to be transferred into more complicated types of assets. I would note just the fixed income treasury line alone at the bottom. Police long-term allocation to fixed income and treasuries is 13%, fires is 21%, compared to 35% for the largest funds before, or even larger for the smaller funds. So you can see that there's going to be a significant difference in investment returns just by the nature of the asset allocation. With that, because of the consolidation and the restriction of the local pension funds no longer investing the assets, we don't come to you with an investment presentation on performance. We did include the April 30th reports from both of the consolidated funds in your packet for information, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Can I just ask one? Those funds, who administers those? Is it the
Great question. So
legislature?
one misconception is that they're handled by the state. They are not. Both entities are distinctly separate entities, separate from states, separate from any state budgeting. And so they are both governed by 9-member elected boards. And so both boards have representation both from public safety as well as from municipal employers. So it's 5-4 on both elected boards. So you have 5 active or beneficiary police or firefighters on the elected board and 4 municipal representatives.
There's no appointed representative?
There is an appointed, under the statute, an appointed position under the Illinois Municipal League, and both of those positions are served by the executive director of the Illinois Municipal League, but he sits in a municipal position because he represents all municipalities in the state. Initially, Joe, the transition board, the first year of calendar 20, those boards were appointed by the governor, but that was just for that first calendar year.
And I'll give a quick plug for those new to the council who might not know. Elizabeth sits on the statewide police pension board, so it's a testament to the job she does. There are, only 4 municipal representatives and throughout the state, and Elizabeth's one. So.
That's great. Any other questions for Elizabeth?
Quick new guy question. So who elects them? They're elected, but who's
So they're
voting?
elected by their groups. So the active fire police representatives are elected by the active members of all local pension boards in the state. Beneficiaries are elected by all beneficiaries or retirees in the state. Municipal are elected by all municipal representatives.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. No other questions? Thank you, Elizabeth. I just wanted to call out just some of the volunteers that have been on the police board and the fire board and were in our meeting today. So Conrad Christensen and Robert Angstrom and Jay Trees on the police board. They've, they've really donated countless hours to the community to, do what's best and to share their knowledge with our community and the pension funds. And so they were both on all 3 of those are on the police board. And then fire board, Gerard Toohey and Patrick Issel. And just thank you to them because they can't present tonight, but it's important that they're still doing hard work. And but thank you for your service and thank you, Elizabeth, for the update. All right, and you're going to stay for the budget calendar. So the next item is to review our FY 2025 budget calendar. In Lake Forest, we spent around 9 months through meetings and going through a budget. And there's workshops and there's city council meetings, and it's very transparent and open, and we really want everybody to understand the opportunities that they can kind of click into on this process. And if you could go over the dates and the process with us, Elizabeth, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. It is hard to believe that we're already preparing for the FY25 budget cycle. But this is a graphic we've been using for years that talks a little bit about the financial aspects of the city, both the audit and the budget. Fiscal year runs May 1 to April 30. You can see in the first few months of the fiscal year, we're really focused on the audit of the prior year financials. That audit field work is occurring as we speak in July. But beginning September, we really start in earnest the budget cycle, and that does go 7, 8, 9 months of the year. We start out with some more philosophical issues like the City Council fiscal policy, which will come to you for review at your October meeting. Then we dig into revenue estimates and the capital planning for the 5-year capital improvement program. The City Council Finance Committee will meet in November to review revenues and capital. And then the staff work throughout the winter to develop the operating budget, and then the City Council Finance Committee meets in March to review the proposed operating budget. And then the full comprehensive fiscal plan is before the City Council for approval in April. This graphic just summarizes the information that was included in your packet. This is a really high-level summary of the budget process for the City of Lake Forest. We're not planning any significant changes for the fiscal year 25 budget. And I've just noted here the specific dates for the 2 budget workshops. Monday, November 13th will be the Revenue and Capital Finance Committee meeting, and the Operating Budget Workshop will be Monday, March 11th. But this just summarizes, and as we get started, we just like to bring this before the City Council Finance Committee so they have an opportunity to review and approve the calendar before we get started. Be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions on the process or the calendar, or? And so do you want us to vote to approve it now, or?
Sure.
Okay, great. And do we do that by a roll call, or?
I think a motion.
A motion? Do I have a motion to approve our calendar for creating a budget for fiscal year 2025?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, passes. Thank you. All right, our next item is any other business, is kind of a catch-all on some of the things we wanted to update all of the committee members on and the public. And so how many folks have actually looked at the flash report and the new one online? Anyone? All right, great. Is it helpful to pull it up and kind of just go through real quick? We just have 1 month on the May flash report. And so some of the signaling, kind of red, yellow, green, may not make that much intuitive sense yet, but as the year progresses, it becomes, kind of much more informative. And so if you wouldn't mind just kind of orienting that for the group. And then there were 2 ambulance and permit fee waivers that we have in our packet and information that was on the old flash report when it was manual, but now it's not on this line, so we have it here if you have questions on that. Take it away. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, the new redesigned flash report is available on the city's website. Each month we'll release that, publish it through the weekly e-news that comes out each Friday. We should have the June report out either the end of this week or the end of next week. And so you'll then begin to start seeing a little bit more information. It's not quite as informational with just 1 month of the fiscal year included, but this is an OpenGov story. And so once you open this, you can scroll through. We start out with a very high-level overview of revenues and expenditures, but for those of you who are new to this, these OpenGov stories are very intuitive, so you can actually drill down. If you want to see more detail on the expenses, you can go down further into this and actually see more detail about different aspects of the expenses that you might be interested in. So you can do that for both revenues and expenses. The next section talks about fund summaries. This is not interactive. This is really subjective. We review this each month. We look at key funds of the city's budget that account for the majority of the revenues and expenditures each year. We're comparing current experience to budget, revenues and expenditures to the 3-year average to identify in what areas we're not trending consistent with our 3-year average. Those are denoted in yellow and red, and then we provide an explanation underneath. Again, as Chairman Preschlack noted, not a lot to glean from 1 month of data, but this will change each month with the flash report depending on year-to-date experience. Next section drills a little bit deeper into key revenues. These are significant revenue sources subject to fluctuation from budget throughout the year. With 2 months and more months of data, you're going to see a line chart. We weren't able to do that with 1 month of data, so Mark did a columnar chart. And what this chart is going to tell you is whether each revenue source is running ahead of budget or behind budget for the year. So you'll be able to go to each revenue source. In this case, building permits is about $120,000 over budget for the year to date. And you'll be able to see these lines change month to month to see if they're continuing to trend ahead, if they're falling behind. So you've got a couple revenues here that fell just for the month below budget, but not by any significant amounts. But that will let you track that throughout the year to see how we're trending. The next section is real estate transfer tax. You're going to see information regarding the number of residential sales activity compared to the last 4 fiscal years. Again, not a lot to see with the 1 month dot right here, but beginning next year, next month you'll see a line. You'll also track revenue generated by commercial RETT. When commercial properties sell, there are usually significant transfer tax amounts, and so we track that, and you can see how the revenue is trending compared to prior years. The right graph is telling you what the average residential sales is for those residential, single-family residences that have transferred title in that year. So it is not projected to be an overall value of properties within the city, but it's telling you what in the current environment residential sales are trending to be per unit. And the last section of this is interest income. This will give you a historical perspective of interest revenue. Obviously, with the Fed rate increases over the last year, in fiscal year 23, our interest revenue was significantly higher than prior years. And then this will trend again month to month to show you how we're comparing to prior years on interest income. And if you click here, there is a link to the most recent cash management investment report if you want to see more detail about cash and investment balances and how those returns are comparing to identified benchmarks. That information is provided. This report is updated quarterly. And so you're seeing now a link to April 30th. The next one would be published in August as of July 31st. And that's the
Okay.
flash report.
Thank you. I know that's a lot of information to take on, but it really is a great tool, and thank you so much for doing it. I think, kind of the real-world practical use of this is during COVID, this was an opportunity for us, to look at our forward-looking expenses or revenue to see where we may be at risk to take proactive action. And sometimes when it's smooth sailing, you kind of look at this and go, okay, it helps me understand the different revenue and expense drivers of the city. But in times of crisis, it's used by management, it's used by us and the staff. And so thank you for putting it together online to give it to everybody. The second item of other business is tonight at the council meeting, we're going to do a final approval of the FY 2024 appropriations and ordinance and rollovers. Can you just touch on that process a little bit and just what we're going to vote on tonight?
Certainly, absolutely. The City Council did grant first reading to the appropriations ordinance and rollovers in June. However, we explained that the rollovers were really premature in June because we were still paying invoices that would be charged back to FY 23. The appropriation ordinance is the legal mechanism for authorizing the expenditure of public funds, although we do a comprehensive fiscal plan and an annual budget. Under state law, the appropriations ordinance is that legal mechanism, and state statutes require that to be approved and filed with the county clerk by the end of the first fiscal year quarter, which is July 31st. So that's why it's on your agenda this evening. So we have the finalized appropriation ordinance with the finalized rollovers included in your packet for consideration.
Great. Thank you. The next item on the other business we wanted to talk about was our pension subcommittee meeting today. And I think, again, just thank you for everybody that serves on those committees. I think taking a really big step back, if you could just go over a bit of, I guess, the work that we did 3 years ago. It was Jed Morris and Tim Newman and Randy and the pension subcommittee under Mayor Lansing being created to address our police and fire pensions proactively. And we hear this term a lot, bend the curve. And what we're trying to do is, instead of just ramping up to assume kind of fully funded in 2040 and just kind of have these just minimum payments and big kind of numbers at the end, is we're trying to proactively manage it and flatline it. And that's a really big deal for a town or a city in Illinois. There's some cities that have 20 to 30% of their budget consumed by these liabilities, and we have more like 5 or 6%. So it's really hats off to everybody on the pension committees, on the council that takes fiscal responsibility seriously. And it's something we all kind of have to be stewards of moving forward. But if you could just touch on that process a little
Not
bit.
a lot to add, you explained it perfectly, but what today's meeting was a joint meeting of the city's pension subcommittee, which is made up of the mayor, the finance committee chair, the city manager, the finance director, and we've talked former Alderman Morris in staying on since he was pivotal in the development of this, so he is remaining on with our pension subcommittee, and that group was met jointly with the Fire Pension Board and the Police Pension Board. And the purpose of the meeting is that we hire an independent actuary each year to do a valuation of both fire and police pension fund and to develop the recommended funding contribution for the city on the tax levy each year. And so Nyhart, the city's independent actuary, presented to the group this afternoon the preliminary results of the fiscal year 23 actuarial valuations and the development of the funding contributions to determine whether or not the city wanted to make any changes in actuarial assumptions or anything like that before finalizing the report. Pension Subcommittee provided direction to continue with the actuarial assumptions we've used the last few years. So he will finalize those reports, and those will be presented to you at your October meeting.
Thank you. Any questions on that or comments? No, okay. And the next item 4 is the state budget, which is on a July 1 to June 30th calendar. Can you give an update on the local government distributed fund, which we're the beneficiaries of per capita for state income, personal and corporate income tax?
Absolutely. This is really good news because, as we know, the state's fiscal year runs just after the cities, and so they tend to have not adopted the state budget when the city's adopting their budget, when the city council's adopting the budget. And so we do worry that there might be unintended consequences or surprises in the state budget that impact the city's budget. So the only aspect that affects the city's budget this year is the allocation of the local government distributive fund, and that is the sharing of both personal and corporate income tax revenue with local governments, and that is shared on a per capita basis using a formula determined by the state. So what this chart shows is a little bit of history regarding the local government distributive fund, and what is graphed here is the personal income tax rate applicable in those years. So from 1969 to 2010, local governments shared in 10% of the total income tax collections received by the state. The personal income tax rate at that time ranged between 2.5% to 3%, but in 2010 was 3%. Then you'll recall that a temporary increase in the personal income tax rate went into effect at 5%. And at that time, the state determined that the LGDF share would be reduced to 6%. And therefore, the local governments did not share in the additional revenue generated by the increased rate. They instead adjusted the formula so that local governments would simply receive what they had been receiving in the most recent year. So that was certainly a disappointment to local governments across the state. That temporary rate timed out, it termed off, but without any final action taken by the General Assembly. And so at that time, the rate was reduced to 3.75%. And so the state increased the LGDF rate to 8%, again, trying to keep local governments held harmless, but again, not receiving the increased revenue. And then as the state financial condition deteriorated in state fiscal year 2018 and 2019, the permanent personal income tax rate of 4.95 went into effect July 1st, 2017, but the state opted to further reduce the percentage given to local governments. And so you can see that as that 4.95% rate has carried through since state fiscal year 2018, there's been only slight improvement in the percentage shared through LGDF each year. But the good news is that they did approve in the state fiscal year 24 budget an increase from 6.16% to 6.47%. Again, local governments led by the Illinois Municipal League continue to lobby the Springfield for restoring the 10% rate that was in effect for so many years. What does that mean from a revenue standpoint? Based on current estimates, the increase in the rate for state fiscal year 24 would generate about $93,000 in additional revenue from what we forecasted by budget. I just put this chart on because, you know, it's been a wild ride the last few years because of COVID. And the unanticipated impact of income tax receipts through COVID was that we received far more than we had before because of the very generous unemployment compensation that was provided during the COVID years, which was taxable at the personal income tax rate. And so those blue lines during the COVID years was some very significant and unanticipated revenue for local governments, which was certainly welcome. But now we have moved back into a more typical year for that. Where do we get our revenue estimates? That's just a clip on the bottom of that slide of the Illinois Municipal League. They put out revenue estimates about quarterly to local governments on the different state shared revenues that are allocated on a per capita basis. So we rely pretty heavily on them because they're connected to Springfield. They're connected to the Department of Revenue. So they tend to know nuances that we don't know. So they help us out on projecting the revenues. That is all I have on LGDF, unless you have any
Thank you.
questions.
Any questions for Elizabeth? Okay, that was great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Really appreciate it. Okay, now is an opportunity for the public to address our committee on any issues that they have and they want to raise. Anyone? Okay, hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn the Finance Committee meeting?
So moved.
Seconded?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, well, take 5 minutes and we'll have the city council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
My chair's